Hello, scholars. Every year at the beginning of the year, I attempt to teach some variation of this lesson, and I don't think I've ever got it quite right, but every year I make another attempt. I hope that this time around you will forgive my poor editing skills and my occasional fits of coughing. I've got a question for you. What makes for good writing? Every year I like to ask my students this question, and here are some of the answers that they give me. Good writing needs to have good vocabulary. Good writing needs to have good grammar. Good writing needs to have great characters and a great story. I agree with all these answers, but I think maybe my question's not specific enough. I might phrase the question this way. What makes for good writing in, say, a menu? Or what makes for good writing in a movie poster? How about good writing in a political ad? Or I might broaden the question like this and simply ask what makes for good communication. Now, to illustrate my thoughts on the answer to this question, I want to read to you from a classic American text, a book that I think you all know and love. You ready? The sun did not shine, it was too wet to play, so we sat in the house all that cold, cold, wet day. I sat there with Sally, we sat there, we two, and I said, how I wish we had something to do. Too wet to go out, too cold to play ball, so we sat in the house. We did nothing at all. So all we could do was to sit, and we did not like it, not one little bit. You recognize this book, right? This is the classic The Cat in the Hat by Dr. Seuss, and I think we would all agree that this is a great work of American literature. But what makes this book so good? Well, it's got a great title character, right? Look at that cat. Okay, it's got a fun story about the house getting totally messed up while mom's away, right? You enjoyed it as a kid. But let me use this text to talk about a sort of rhetorical model for good communication. Okay, we've got our author, that's Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss. We've got our text, The Cat in the Hat, and we have our audience, which would have been children in the 1950s originally. Now, you know those things, right? But what you might not know is the purpose for which the text was written. So think to yourself, why would someone go about writing a story about a cat messing up a house? If you don't have the answer, let me read or share a little information, I guess. I'll read part of this and share some of it. Okay, in 1954, Life magazine ran an article by John Hersey titled, Why Do Students Bog Down on First R? And this article was really critical about the reading materials that were being used at the time to teach children to read. And at the time, when you thought reading materials, you thought the Dick and Jane books. So the Dick and Jane books, I think they were probably better than what came before them, perhaps, but they were a little problematic. We had these adorable kids who never got in trouble and never got dirty. They were all white. And another problem was the books weren't designed to teach phonics, like sounding out words. So instead, you'd have a bunch of words repeated. You'd add basically one new word per page. These books were just a little bit dull. So William Spalding, who was the director of Houghton Mifflin's Education Division, that's a publishing company, he contacted Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss, and he challenged him to write a book that would be for 6- and 7-year-olds who'd already sort of mastered the basics of reading. And he wanted him to write a book that kids could not put down. So what is the purpose for The Cat in the Hat? Well, it was written to teach kids to read. Here's a question for you then. How does the text, The Cat in the Hat, fulfill its purpose of teaching kids to read? We're talking 5- or 6-year-olds. Well, take a look first at the picture. Pictures can help kids when they're learning to read, because if you're trying to figure out what a word is and there's a picture right there, that can clue you in as to what that word might be. Now, another thing you might look at is the words themselves. So The Cat in the Hat only contains, I believe, 236 different words. That's not a huge number of words, right? And these are words that you want to encounter and practice when you're first learning to read. Most of these words are phonetic, meaning you can sound them out. You can say k, to make the word cat. Then you can, again, practice those basic phonics without having to worry about the weird words where the spellings don't really match the pronunciation. Okay, another thing here you'll notice is that the book is written in rhyme. So I've got fall, high, ball, hat, do, cat. Now, the nice thing about rhymes, again, is they help you predict what a word is going to be. And then, of course, on top of all that, we have a story that's fun, right? Definitely a wild tale, right, of misbehavior here. And fun helps with learning. Sorry, guys, when my lessons get boring, right? All right, so we've got an author, we've got a story, we've got an audience, and we've got a purpose, and that text does a nice job of fulfilling its purpose. And I want to point out one more thing here about this particular text. No text exists in a vacuum. They were created in a particular time in a particular place. And so when we think about this book, we also have to think about the context in which it was created. In this case, it was a state of reading materials back in the 50s that prompted William Spalding to ask Theodore Geisel to write this book. And if we're talking about rhetoric, this is what might be called the occasion that prompted the text to be written. Now, when you're in a particular time and place, your context can feel pretty natural. It can feel invisible, right? We can look back and say, oh, yes, look at the 50s. Wasn't that great? Okay, but when you were there, it was just what was normal. Now, I imagine if 100 years from now someone looks back and they look at the Cat in the Hat, then they'll be able to see the things that to them will no longer seem normal. For example, that dress with its polka dots. Will that seem normal? Will that seem natural? Will that just seem a regular part of the culture? Perhaps not. In fact, we can look at this text and see some things that have already changed. For example, one thing that strikes me about this book every time I read it is that these kids look awfully young for mom to be gone. I don't think today you could get away with a book where you have children this young who are just left to their own devices for a long afternoon, right? And in fact, in the, I think it was 2003 film, which wasn't very good, guys, but they actually bring in a babysitter. But of course, the babysitter couldn't be interfering with the cat's antics, so she was a very sleepy babysitter, present, but not actually part of the story much. Okay, so what's the larger point here about this text and about text in general? Again, if a text is good, most of the time it's working for its particular target audience. And most of the time it's fulfilling its purpose. It's got something it's trying to do and it does it well. And when we have this happy marriage of these elements, that's when we can typically say communication is good. Now, I hope this sounds pretty obvious too when I say it like this. But for me, it was a revelation when I left high school to realize that not all good writing looked the same. I thought that every paper had to have an intro, a 3-paragraph body, and a conclusion written in a particular style. And while that format works very nicely for many things, it is certainly not the only way to write, and it's certainly not the best way to write for many purposes.